Hi everybody, Professor Kauser here. If you look down the Moodle page, you will see that with Unit 4 in a couple of weeks and change, you have your first paper due, which is something called a source study. I'm going to put in some more specific instructions there. I'm also going to add a document onto the Moodle page called How to Write a History Paper, which is written with a source study in mind. It's about 10 pages long. And I'm going to put some of the same information here in this video, so if you prefer to look at that document and see there, you can do that and watch the video. That's fine. You may find both helpful, or you may prefer one or the other. But the source study, let me talk a little bit about what this assignment is. It's a 5-page paper. It should be double-spaced in Times New Roman font with 1-inch margins, so that should give you a sense of the scope of paper that we're talking about here. The idea is to write an essay analyzing one primary source. Okay? Now, primary sources, remember, are sources that are written by people during the time period in the society that you're trying to study, as opposed to secondary sources, which are works of modern scholarship about those people. Okay, so you're looking at primary sources from people at the time: documents, letters, narratives, journals, all those kinds of things. Those are all primary sources, like I think I talked about in an earlier video lecture. And the idea here is to pick just one primary source. Don't pick two, don't compare and contrast, just pick one, and write an essay analyzing it. Okay, so we're going to talk a little bit about what we expect to see happening in a paper about such a primary source. You don't need to do research, you don't need to bring in additional material, you don't need to get out there and scour the internet or anything like that. You're just picking one thing, use that one document as your piece of evidence, and write your essay about the society it came from using just that piece of evidence. Okay, put the blinders on and just focus on that one thing. Okay, this is a really important assignment for me because this is really intended to teach what historians actually do, right? Just as scientists perform experiments in order to get data to form their theories from, historians work from primary sources, and so you need to get used to not getting distracted and carried away in all these other kinds of things. They're useful for other kinds of papers, but for this one I just want you to focus on the skill of analyzing a primary source. One thing that means, by the way, you don't need to get it right. You may come up with ideas on the basis of that evidence which are not the reality of what happened in history. I'm not looking for did you get the right answer, I'm looking for did you build a plausible interpretation with the limited evidence that you were able to work from. Okay, it's really about using evidence and interpreting it in a thoughtful kind of a way here. When I say it's an essay, it's an important point here, because an essay is not a report. The goal here is not to simply pass along information. That's what a report does. Essay comes from a French word that means to attempt something. And what an essay attempts to do is to persuade the reader, right? There should be a persuasive quality here. We'll talk about ways I do and don't want you to try and persuade me. But you should be writing in order to argue a thesis. Okay, not just giving information, but putting forward an argument, interpreting the source in favor of a particular thesis based on that evidence. Okay, that's going to be the other key quality here. So how do you go about writing such a paper? What I think really works for students is to understand that the process of preparing to write is as important, maybe even more important, than the writing itself. If you get that preparatory process down correctly, then you can write a strong paper that will be guaranteed at least a B, maybe an A, whereas if you skip and just start writing, you're very likely going to wind up with a C paper. And I'll talk about the criteria that are going to wind us up at some of those grade points as we go along. So the pre-writing process, the preparatory process, is going to be key to success here. The way I like to describe that preparatory process for an historian is something I call the funnel, because it's going to start wide and then narrow down to a point as we go along, right? Sorry, the camera angle isn't good here. We're starting wide and narrowing down as you move through the process. The widest stage, the first stage, is what we call the stage of coming up with your topic. Okay, topic stage. First of all, what's the paper about? And to put together a topic, you need two things. You need the source, and you need what I call an approach to that source. Now, the source is going to be the primary source that you're choosing. It needs to be a primary source. Let me give you some advice about choosing a primary source. You can use any primary source that's relevant to the class. The class is world history since 1500. Anything written in world history since 1500 is fair game. You're going to write two source studies. I would like your first one to be something prior to 1800 AD, your second one to be something after 1800. Okay? So for your first one, take a look at our Sources of World Societies book. Pick any primary source you like from that book, something that's written since 1500, preferably, and before 1800. Okay? The other thing is pick something that gives you enough material to work with. All right? This is a common mistake for students. Some of the sources in there are very short. They're just a page or two long. You're going to be writing a 5-page paper, and it's actually difficult. It's more difficult to get 5 pages worth of essay out of a 2-page source than it is to get 5 pages worth of essay out of a 5 or 6-page source. Right? Pick something that's a little more substantial. It's got a little more meat on the bones, so you've got something to work with to get yourself 5 pages of essay there. Don't make the mistake of thinking you're making it easier by picking a shorter source. That actually makes the job harder, not easier. Okay, so there's a bit of advice there. Also, by the way, you're not limited to sources that are in the Sources of World Societies book. If you want to use something else, you may do so. Please run it by me just to make sure it's appropriate, but you should be able to do that. And one thing in particular, a lot of the sources in the book are excerpts out of longer works, and one easy way to come up with just more material is go hit the library or hit the internet and find the longer work that this excerpt was taken out of, right? And then you'll pick a longer chunk of it than what's been assigned on the syllabus, okay? But something maybe 5 pages long, 10 pages long, that's usually the ballpark you want to be looking in for selecting a source. Okay, so that's one, pick a source. The other thing to coming up with your topic is what kind of approach are you going to take to that source? And when I say approach, what I mean is what kind of history are you going to do with it? What aspect of human experience do you want to use the source to explore? Okay, that's what I mean by the approach of it. What area of human endeavor are we interested in here? And here again, it's totally open. I'm not going to assign you a type of paper you have to write. Think about what you're interested in and you want to follow. I like to use a framework of 5 broad approaches to history, general kinds of history that historians do, and use that in order to help organize your thought. So let me run through the 5 quickly. First off is political history. Political history means the study of power. It's the first thing a lot of people think of when they think of history. It's a lot of what we're doing in this course is political history. That means looking at rulers, governments, laws, things governments do like fight wars against each other. Those are all aspects of political history. But fundamentally it's an issue of who has power, how do they get power, how is it distributed, what are the limitations of their power, what can they use it for. An aspect of it could be how is power justified, right? But military matters, diplomacy, law, government, all that kind of stuff tends to fall under political history. Okay, so you could use your source to say, okay, what are we finding out about politics here? Second approach to history is economic history, right? Instead of looking at power, where power comes from, economic history looks at wealth, right? How are people living, thriving, and surviving? What kinds of work are they doing? How is wealth being generated and distributed and moved around? What's primary production? Agriculture, industry? What sort of forms does trade and commerce and exchange take? Monetary systems, financial systems, banking, all these kinds of things. These are all aspects of economic history. Okay, so you might do political history, you might do economic history. Third category is what we call social history. Social history is sometimes a bit confusing to people, so I want to make sure you understand it clearly. It doesn't mean just whatever's going on in society, because that's all of history. That doesn't really define anything. Social history means how does a community categorize people and manage relationships between people in different categories? Okay, what sort of norms and expectations are there for people placed into different categories? And for the kinds of categories we're thinking of here, you could probably think of a few. Classic example would be social class, right? What's upper class, middle class, lower class? What defines what class you're in? Is it possible to move back and forth between classes? Is there social mobility? Is there slavery? Is there nobility? Studies of those kinds of things are social history. Also things like ethnicity and race. How does an ethnic group define itself and create its boundaries and decide who's a member and who's not, and what sort of expectations are there for people, or what rights or privileges or prejudices are there involving people from particular groups that way. Gender is a category of social history, right? Male and female, and how does society assign roles and tasks and responsibilities and rights to men and women. So that would be a category. Age groups can be a category, right? The young, the old, the elderly, the mature, childhood. How are these groups defined? When do you make your passage from childhood to adulthood, and how do your responsibilities change based on that? All these kinds of things, and there are other ways of categorizing people you could probably think of. But these are all aspects of social history. So that's our third category. You've got political history, you've got economic history, third would be social history. Fourth category is intellectual history, and that means when people are pursuing education and thinking about big ideas, what do they think about? This might be stuff like philosophy, science, theology, literary criticism, all sorts of things, stuff you do in school, basically, think through departments of a college, and that'll give you kind of a sense of the various things that might be counted under intellectual history. How do people learn the ideas of their society? How do they become intellectuals? What sort of ideas do intellectuals think about and debate about? How do they construct their ideas? Are they using an experimental method, or are they appealing to authorities or traditions or whatnot? All these things are aspects of intellectual history. And then finally, after political, economic, social, and intellectual history, there's also cultural history. Cultural history is kind of a mushy category. Again, like social history, it doesn't mean just everything going on in the culture, because that would be everything. But cultural history means the ways that people think and feel and express themselves that aren't really sort of the self-conscious activity of intellectual life. Okay? People's attitudes, their values, their prejudices, their morals, their beliefs, their modes of expression, things like art and literature tend to fall into cultural history. Religion falls into cultural history a lot. A lot of different areas can come under cultural history. Okay, but these 5 things can give you different approaches you might take to your source. So what I want you to do is pick one. Or you may come up with something which is kind of a hybrid between them. If you're talking about ideology, right, you might be talking about political philosophy that's going to blend together intellectual history and political history. That's okay. These are not straitjackets that have to be totally walled off from each other. But don't try to do just everything, right? Pick something which is the aspect of life, the aspect of society that you want to use your source to discuss. Focus, narrow down, zero in on one particular thing. Don't try to be broad and cover everything in the source study. That does not lead to a successful paper. Okay. So when you put that together, you now have a topic, right? A political history, political history based on, the voyages of Columbus or something, Columbus's journal, being the actual primary source there, or something like that. Or, cultural history using, what am I thinking of, the short account of the destruction of the Indies, what sort of values and morals are represented in that text, that kind of a thing. That's a topic. Okay, so now you've got your broad category. You know what your paper's about. You're doing culture, you do it on the basis of this source. What you want to do then, after, of course, reading your source and taking a heap of notes, is start brainstorming a question. The thing that makes an essay different from a report is an essay is trying to answer a question, and coming up with a question is the most important thing you're going to do. I cannot emphasize that enough. Without a question, you don't have an essay. Okay, you've got to ask a question. It should be an actual sentence that begins with a capital letter and ends with a question mark that you can read and say, this is the question my paper will set out to answer. Okay, so ask a question. Your topic will guide you to your question. Okay, if we're doing cultural history using de las Casas's brief account of the destruction of the Indies, and within that culture we particularly want to maybe look at religion and say, what does Christianity mean for de las Casas? Now, we're starting to get towards a question, right? In a sense, you put your approach together with your source, and that gives you a starting point for a question, right? What does this source tell me about this aspect of human society, right? What does the short account of the destruction of the Indies tell me about religion in early modern, imperial Spain? Okay, that's the kind of idea you want to do here. Now that gives you a broad, a general question. That's a good point to start with. At that point, you want to start brainstorming variations on the question. Again, looking to narrow it down, looking to come up with something more focused, if possible. So, for example, I just talked about morality. Are we talking about sexual morality? Are we talking about the morality of violence? Are we talking about the morality of a sort of wealth and generosity here, a particular moral value? Right? You can pick something that will enable you to focus your question even more than just saying cultural history, or even just saying religion and morals or something like that. Right? You'll zero in on a particular theme or issue within the source that fits your approach. Okay? So you want to brainstorm a whole bunch of variants of your question, and then you want to eliminate the weak questions. And let me tell you what makes for weak questions. Weak questions make for weak essays. So you want to eliminate weak questions and pick the question that you brainstormed, which is your strongest one. One thing you want to eliminate: any question which brings a value judgment into your paper. On the forums already, I've posted a couple of times stressing this. As an historian, you want to aim for as much objectivity as you can possibly manage. It is not your job to pass judgments on the people you are studying. That is not the historian's job. As a human being, in your own life, you may very well, of course, go past your moral judgments. That's fine. I'm not expecting you to cease being moral people in life, of course, but the historian's task is to understand people, not to judge them. Okay, that's absolutely critical. Judgments can be either positive or negative, right? So if you start saying, your questions are being, why did this horrible thing, or what's so horrible about it, or was the Spanish conquest of the Americas a good thing or a bad thing? You start hearing that language about good and bad. Why was Napoleon such a great leader? Oh, there's a value judgment there about leadership and greatness, right? You want to eliminate all that. Aim for objectivity. Don't work from a question that's going to set you up to be passing value judgments. If the paper is driven by a value judgment, that's what I call an editorial, not an essay. It's not really analyzing the history of what's going on. Instead, what it's telling me is your reaction to what's going on, which is not what the assignment is. Editorials generally get a C. Okay, now if you're happy with a C, go ahead and write an editorial. I'll give you a C, but I'm hoping all of you want to do better in the grades than that. So no editorials, set the value judgments aside. The other thing you want to watch out for are questions that are too easy to answer, right? If you look at your question and you realize that anybody who has read the source could answer that question without needing to think about it, then you don't really have material for a strong essay, right? I'm trying to think of an example here. Does De las Casas approve of Spanish violence in the Americas? No, of course he doesn't. Okay, what's your 4.5 pages of the rest of your paper going to be about? I don't know. You kind of answered that right away. It's obvious. There's not much there to write about. And usually when people ask too easy of a question, they don't really have a thesis to argue, and they wind up just going into report mode, just passing along the information that's in the text. A report which is not really digging and building an argument, but is just passing along information, that also will be limited to a C in the grade. So it'll pass. Some of you may be content with a C. I hope not. Like to give you all stronger grades than that, so avoid the questions that are too easy to answer. Okay. So you're brainstorming, looking for something that's going to require some thought. It's going to require some analysis. It's going to require digging evidence out of the source and rolling it over and looking at it from different angles and comparing it with different parts of the source in order to be able to really come up with an answer to the question, because it's a tough question. But it's not also, it's also avoiding dragging you into value judgments. By the way, one way which is an easy way to tweak a value judgment paper into a better, more objective paper, instead of asking, say, was the Spanish conquest a good or a bad thing, ask, why does De las Casas think, it was a good or a bad thing? Or how could he have, what would have needed to happen for him to think of it as a good thing? That starts getting, that's still a little on the easy side, but that starts getting you into more objective kind of territory. What is De las Casas' model for the way Spanish rule of the Americas ought to work? Okay. That might be a little more challenging. You're going to have to dig in the text a little bit more, look at the things he criticizes, and start thinking about what are the assumptions behind that, and how you might get at a more, get at what his vision for a successful thing would be. But by making it his morality rather than your morality, now you've moved out of the editorial zone and gotten into a good objective essay analyzing his morals, which is fine. Okay, so anyway, you brainstorm, you come up with a question. Okay, it's a good question. It's going to push you to go into depth, to analyze in some depth, not too easy to answer. There's no value judgments implied in it, so it's objective, and now you're on a good point to start from. Your paper is going to be all about answering that question. And that brings us to the final stage of the funnel. Right? You start abroad with a topic, your source and your approach. You use the source and approach together with a bunch of brainstorming to come up with a question. Now what you need to do, read, take a bunch of notes, and decide what you think the answer to that question is. Right? The answer to your question is your thesis. Okay, and that's important. I've seen teachers before, my kids in high school and stuff have had this, who will talk as though a thesis means a topic sentence. It's not, right? A thesis is the answer to a question. And again, just like the question was a specific sentence that started with a capital letter and ended with a question mark, your thesis should also be a specific sentence that you could actually write out that begins with a capital letter, ends with a period, and that I can clearly identify this is the point, the thesis you are going to argue for in the paper. This is what you are saying the answer to your question is. Okay? So, funnel process, topic, source plus approach, ask a question, answer the question with a thesis. Okay? That's the preparatory process. You can't start writing a paper till you know what's the question I'm asking and trying to answer here. What is the thesis I'm going to argue for as the correct answer to that question? Okay, so that's the preparatory process. Now you're ready to start writing. You may have used it already. Generally, the best framework to use for these essays is what we call the 5-point essay. And guess what? I assigned a 5-page paper. So you can kind of think, a page per point, and that ought to work out pretty well. So 5-point essay, how does that work? In a 5-point essay, you have point 1, your introduction. Points 2, 3, and 4 are what we call your body sections, right? Developing the essay as you go along. Point 5 is your conclusion. So let's look at each of these sections and the jobs that they do. So first of all, your introduction. First thing your introduction should do in just a few sentences, give me some background information. Who's the author of your source? When were they writing? Who were they writing for? What genre of source is it? Maybe a quick summary of what the source is about in just a sentence or two. You don't need to, report the whole thing back to me, but sort of summarize it in a boiled down form in a couple of sentences there, right? So background information. And then your introduction should also tell me what your question is, right? Don't hide it. Don't make me guess it. Tell me the question this source raises for me is, boom, and tell me what the question is. In this essay, I want to try and figure out, here's my question. Okay, make that loud and clear and, right where I can tell. Okay, now I know what this essay is going to try to answer. Now, if you give me a little bit of background information, you've asked the question, and then finally your introduction should tell me, no reason to keep it secret, tell me, I'm going to argue that this, my thesis, is the answer to the question I just asked. Okay, so I'm going to walk you through it. Okay, so your introduction, background information, tell me what your question is, tell me what your thesis is that you're going to argue. Okay, set me up for where you're going so I know what I'm looking at here. That's the introduction. Okay, then you get body paragraphs or body sections. There may be multiple paragraphs in each section depending on how you organize your thought. What you want to do with these body sections is build an argument step by step. Show me that your thesis is right. Okay? So each of those sections ought to take an aspect of the thesis, an aspect of the question. First you need to look at A, then you need to look at B, then you need to look at C, right? And sort of show me step by step, building the argument, how this all adds up to a plausible argument, a plausible thesis, a plausible answer to your question. In deciding what each of those body sections is going to be about, the best way to do it, there's no one thing I can tell you because it's going to very much depend on the individual essay, but you want to design them around the logic of your argument, not the order of the source. Okay? In other words, there should be, here's a sort of a subtopic that you want to get across to me first, and you may be pulling that from the beginning of the source, you may be pulling it from the end, you may be pulling it from the middle, that's fine, pull the material from wherever, but let it be the logic of here's a concept you want me to get first, and then a concept I need to get second, building on that, and then a concept I should get third, building on that, so that the whole thing fits together into an argument. Okay? The weaker form that I see a lot of are what I call commentary papers. In a commentary papers, the sections of the paper do not follow the logic of an argument. They follow the order in which things get mentioned in the source. First De Las Casas talks about X, then De Las Casas talks about Y, then De Las Casas talks about Z. It's not concepts that you are choosing to argue to me about. It's just following him along. The first thing he says, the next thing he says, the next thing he says, and it tends to sort of have a quote from the source, and then this means blah, 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 and here's another quote from the source, and this means blah, 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 and there's another quote from the source, this means blah, blah, blah. Now, a commentary paper at its worst can degenerate into just a report. All you're doing is just saying what the source says and then kind of paraphrasing it again afterwards. And there's no interpretation going on, there's no analysis going on. You're just, quoting it and then putting it in your own words and quoting it, putting your own words again. That ends up really just being a report, and even if there was something that looked like a thesis at the beginning, you're still turning into a report here because, there's no real analysis or interpretation or argument going on. So that's at its worst. At its best, a commentary can still be an okay paper. They tend to wind up in the B grade, though, and not to get an A because they don't really show your mastery of the concept you're trying to argue. It doesn't show you leading me through an argument. It's more just sort of, observations as you go along. It's a little bit less impressive, frankly. So take control of your material, break it down, and ask, how can I fit together a logical argument using all these various pieces of evidence, and let me see the strength of your argument. Okay? So commentary papers tend to get a B. If there were really no interpretation going on, they turn into C's. Rarely do they make an A. That they would really need some brilliant insights for a commentary paper to rise to A level. Okay, so anyway, that's one thing. And of course, implied in there, hopefully you picked up on it now, since you're trying to persuade me that your thesis is right, you need to be quoting your source, right? So you need to be pulling the source, use it as your body of evidence from which you're going to build your argument. You need to show me the evidence. You need to analyze it, talk about the wording, talk about the ambiguities in the text, anything you see going on there, but how all this adds up to evidence, maybe the assumptions underlying some of the things your author says, that kind of a thing, or how what he says on one page relates to something he says on another page, and how those ideas connect to each other. You want to do these things in order to show how all this is adding up to a strong argument, how your case is going to get made here. Okay, so those are your body sections, right, sort of 3 subtopics, each bringing forward quotes and evidence in the text in order to build a case. Finally, you get to your conclusion. What should the conclusion do? One thing the conclusion can do is it can go back and review the argument, right? Take a paragraph or a few sentences and go back through, okay, so we started out asking this question, I proposed this thesis, and we saw point A, point B, point C, how it is that my thesis actually works. Okay, so that's one thing. People sometimes say with a 5-point essay, tell them what you're going to tell them, and then tell them what you told them, right? Sort of, tell me where you're going in your introduction, walk me through the argument in the body sections, and then go back and review it and sort of sum it up in your conclusion. The other thing that you can do in your conclusion is ask, so what? Right? You may remember I was telling you before, focus, zero in, narrow down, you're only looking at one primary source, you're only looking at one kind of approach you're taking, and even within that you're zeroing in on something very specific. The more specific you get, the stronger in general. Now, okay, pull the frame back a little bit. What does this have to do with anything? What does this tell me about early modern history? What does it tell me about world history? What does it tell me about human society in general and life, the universe, and whatever, is going on there? Any wider implications that you see to what you discovered in the course of building your argument, these can all go into a conclusion. They're not part of your argument. They're more sort of reflecting on the significance of what you argued once you've completed it. The other thing about that, so what, back when I was talking about questions, I said no value judgments, keep it objective, keep your value judgments out of it. It may be that you've had very strong, say, moral reactions to what you were reading. It may have been horrifying to you. It may have been impressive and admirable to you. Either way, don't put them in your argument, but after you've completed your argument and gotten to your conclusion, then you can share those kinds of reflections. That's the time when you can say, this was all a terribly horrifying, tragic thing, or this is a wonderful, admirable kind of thing I hope we can, learn from and imitate, or wherever you want to go with it. But the conclusion, not the argument, but the conclusion is the place to do that. Okay, so that's what the essay is about. An A paper will have a really great, thoughtful, insightful question. It'll, really it'll go out on a limb and stake out a very daring, thoughtful thesis. It'll be clearly organized. It'll use some very well-selected, chosen quotes from the text in order to support its argument, sum up nicely. A B paper will do most of that, but it may not be quite so penetrating, not quite so insightful. It may slip into commentary mode, something like that. A C paper usually means you've got either a report or an editorial here where, there isn't really an objective analytical thesis being argued. You're either just talking about, what's good or bad about something, or just talking about, passing along information without any real analysis or interpretation going on. Those tend to get the C's. And F will be, it may just plain not be long enough. I assign a 5-page paper. I expect to see at least 4 pages written. Really make sure you get onto the 5th page. It may be plagiarized, where you're quoting things without citing them. It's very important to cite your sources. It may simply be incoherent and I can't make out what it's doing at all. It may be completely off topic, where it's not a history paper, or it doesn't relate to history since 1500, or it doesn't analyze a primary source at all. Things like that. Hopefully none of those things will happen. Finally, one thing I should mention about my grading policy. When I assign grades, I just use a 4-point system. Everything gets a straight letter grade, A, B, C, or F. I don't use convoluted rubrics with, 100 points, broken out where, one set of grammar mistakes is going to lose you 4 points, but another set of grammar mistakes might get you 3 points. I don't think it's entirely honest, to tell you the truth, to pretend that, humanities papers are that precise in their grading. But I will use the criteria that I'm talking about here. I will be looking for a question and thesis, criteria number 1. I'll be looking at the development of your argument using the evidence and interpreting your evidence as criteria point number 2. I'll be looking at how the paper is written. Is it long enough? Is it correctly formatted? Is it good readable English? Are citations used for your quotes? That'll be criteria number 3. Between those, I will decide if the paper is outstanding, good, fair, or simply not good enough. Okay, and that will be the grade points that will be used. Finally, one last thing about this assignment. You do not need to work on it in isolation. I encourage you to ask me questions, shoot me emails, send me drafts of your papers if you want to. I will reply to them as rapidly as I'm able to, with suggestions for ways in which it might be improved, or telling you what's strong or weak about them. Don't treat it as something to go hole up in a shell and sort of cast it to the wind and see how the grade comes out. Run it by me before the due date and get some feedback on it. The one thing I do want to say there, though, is that if you do want to send me a draft, make sure you send it to me at least 48 hours before it's due. That will allow me enough time to look at it and think about it and reply to you, and you still have time to reply to my response. Okay, don't send it to me the night before it's due or something and expect to get a response in time for you to do anything about it. That usually doesn't work. So allow a 48-hour buffer there. Okay, shoot me any questions you want to by email or on the forums, and I will look forward to seeing the papers when they come in.